Welcome, football fans, to the very first episode of the One Foot Down podcast. I'm your host, Chris, and I've got the incomparable Mike Haas riding shotgun. We are stoked to present the Fantasy and Frames College Fantasy Football podcast. And tonight, we're not just discussing, we're dissecting some of our favorite transfer portal players as we gear up for the explosive 2024 season. Mike, let the saga begin.
Welcome, football fanatics, to the One Foot Down podcast on the Fantasy and Frames Network. Your gridiron guides, Chris and Mike, are geared up to lead you through the thrilling world of college fantasy football. Whether we're diving into Power 5 giants or uncovering hidden gems, brace yourselves for expert insights, analysis, and daring predictions. Stay in the game. Subscribe, rate, and review. This is your 2024 source for college fantasy football dominance. Let the fantasy frenzy begin.
Welcome, everybody, to the show. Like I said at the top, I'm your host, Chris, and with me is my co-host, Mike Haas. Mike, we've been working on this thing for quite some time now. Our first episode is here. How you feeling, my good man?
Well, nervous energy, but good energy. The season's right around the corner. Senior Bowl week is coming fast and furious.
Yeah. We got measurements today live from the Senior Bowl. So there's some guys that have been rising and falling, but that's NFL talk. We're not here to talk NFL. We are, again, a college fantasy football podcast. Mike, let the people know what college fantasy football is. Let them know what you take out of this show. Let them know what you want to give the people out of this show. Let them know what to expect as a whole from the One Foot Down podcast, man.
Yeah, okay. So just a few points. I've been playing, I'd say, a few years, and Chris, we played against each other in college fantasy football and have enjoyed it. There can be a lot of data involved in the college since there's so many teams. It can seem a little daunting at times, but really comparable to the NFL, that it runs the very same way. Leagues can run all the different ways and variables that the NFL runs. So if you enjoy the NFL, there's no reason that you won't enjoy the college. So don't be intimidated, I would say, is point one, by all the different players. And there's so many to choose from, and how am I going to get to know them all? So that kind of led me to point two, that we know we're living in an era of data and everybody wants to get into all the different sites and things, and that makes college even better. People that love that and want to do that, they can get right into it that way. But so I enjoy the different the one note I can say, I enjoy the different ways you can develop in the college. You can have massive lineups of 70 people and they're gonna join as we're playing now, Chris, or you can have smaller ones that are first ones we were involved in, of smaller lineups and maybe geared more towards the teams. You can tailor the league however you want when your commissioner lays down the bylaws or whatever. So I would say, no, the creativity with it and the different ways, hey, just jump right in. Don't be intimidated by the 130 some odd teams that can be out there in the pool.
Yeah. And you don't have to go that deep. If you're just starting off in the college fantasy football landscape, you can dumb it down to just Power 5 schools. You can go by conference. You can play just SEC fantasy football. It's very customizable based on how you want to approach it, so you're not so intimidated off the jump, right, Mike? And Fantrax is really the only platform where you can get access to college fantasy right now, and they're always upgrading either their app or their web browser every year to make it better for the end user. So for me, college football was always like that, for lack of a better analogy, was always that side chick for me. And the NFL was kind of like my wife, you know what I mean? And I would always go to college football to get what I wanted out of it. But when it needed me for, you know, Mountain West games or Tuesday action, I was never there for it. And eventually that relationship grew for me in terms of college football. And that side chick turned into a love. And it's a relationship that I've nurtured. And now, you know, the NFL is my new ex-wife, and I'm living with my new girl in college football, and I absolutely love it. 130 plus teams, thousands of players. The variables is what I love about the college fantasy game so much. You are never out of it. Unlike an NFL fantasy format, you can get behind the 8 ball really quick, and then your season's over after week 4, week 5. If a few of your top drafted players get injured and you lose those guys for the year, where college fantasy football, Mike, I mean, you've seen me do it. You can refresh your team on a weekly basis. I was down 5.
Well, hold it. Did you copy me or did I copy you? I mean, I can't even remember anymore.
Mike, I got to give it to you, man. You are one of the most successful fantasy football players, one of the most successful college fantasy football players that I've ever had the chance to play with. And when we talked about doing this and I approached you to do this, and I know you wanted to hop on the mic for quite some time, man, I couldn't think of anyone better to chop up college football with. So I'm excited you're here. I'm excited to be part of the college fantasy football community. So let's get to why we're here. Let's not waste any more of the people's times. Let's talk about some of our favorite transfer portal players heading into the 2024 season. With the way that college football is structured at the moment, with nil packages and everything else going down in college football, the transfer portal is one of the most exciting times in the college football landscape. And it's accumulating move after move, high profile player after high profile player, leaving program after program. And we're going to give you 8 of our favorite ones heading in to the 2024 season. And Mike, I know you're a Fighting Irish fan, and this one off the top is a guy that is true to your Fighting Irish heart, and that is Riley Leonard. So let the people know why Riley Leonard should be targeted in your upcoming college fantasy drafts.
Alrighty, yeah, like looking at that card, like look at that right on the screen, Fantasy and Frames, Riley Leonard, 125 card right there. What is that worth right now if you sell that online?
Yeah, a cool 50 cents.
Cool 50 cents. Well, with that, so it's interesting. Last year, the game where Riley went into Notre Dame, him and Sam Hartman are good buddies, actually, and a lot of respect there between the two of them. And they battled it out in that game. And one of the points, Riley last year, his numbers weren't as good, but he got a couple injuries and tried to play through them. And Duke was having a really good year, but his injuries kind of caught up to him.
Yeah.
So in the transfer portal, though, his good pedigree, solid, throwing arm, can make all the throws, dual threat, can run the ball, and he's 6'4", 212 pounds, and can go, right? So a couple stats so that people, you want to look at some recent history when, to prepare for your draft, just like we do for the NFL draft, same in college, looking at the last couple years to give yourself something to go on. And in 2022, Riley had 33 total touchdowns there at Duke, 20 passing touchdowns, 13 rushing touchdowns, 2,967 yards with almost 64% completion rate. So on the national stage in 2022, Riley had really hit, he was talked about quite a bit. Yeah. And leading into the year as a candidate last year. So I chose him here, in 2023, you could say it was a bit of a down year, but yet everybody was still high on him. And it's not a problem on his talent and on who he is as a football player. He only got to start 7 games, He did rush for 4 TDs again last year and 352 yards, and he threw 3 TDs. Completion down a little bit at about 57%. And then those injuries caught up to him. So I find that he'll be, when you're trying to draft, part of my strategy to give away some trade secrets here that you
That's
do.
why I invited you to the
That's
show,
why we're
buddy.
here. But when we look at all of the data and we rank every player that you'd like to rank, or you see all the rankings, it can get overwhelming when I jump into fantasy and everyone might put somebody on the ladder there in a different spot, rank a little different, and sometimes you can get overwhelmed seeing all the rankings, then you don't know where he would fall for you, say, on that ranking. You're kind of talking your way out of it and you change whatever. So I kind of bring into the mix what I'm seeing, what I'm watching. So I make sure I try to watch, kind of as much as you can of the games and see some of the tendencies for yourself, like how you watch film. But watching the live games really always helps me on determining how a player is doing in certain games, where I think he's going to go. Having a hunch is okay, and backing that hunch up with solid data is obviously to make a good choice when you're trying to draft. But I've always, grown for years, 20 years playing fantasy stuff. Go on what you think the next guy is going to be for the next year. That's how you're going to win a league, because rarely does it happen that they keep repeating the solid seasons. We wish it was that way. There are certain players that way, but they're not all that way. So I'll give you 1 point last year, off topic here, but like Ja'Cory Brooks was a major wide receiver to draft and all over the place. And I picked him and I drafted him, and it didn't work. And I was taking into account everybody's ratings and rankings, and yes, he had a good year, and then it was a down year. And someone later on I'm going to talk about tonight, the same thing. So you got to take your wins and losses when you're drafting in fantasy, just same as in the NFL. But anyway, just to finish off on Riley, you're coming to a great coach, Marcus Freeman. You're coming to a team, Riley, that is good on both sides of the ball. Defensively, that's going to help you. Hopefully, you get rest on the sidelines, you can gear up. If you're dual threat, you'll have energy to run. He always makes good adjustments. He's looking down the field, Riley, constantly. He's never given away a play. That's something that Notre Dame, historically, that's how they like to play. That's their identity of you don't give up on no play on both sides of the ball and keep it going. That's why I think it's a good fit. Interestingly, him choosing to go to Notre Dame, his great grandfather played at Notre Dame in 1940.
No, yeah, look at that.
1940.
Bloodline is there in Notre Dame,
and he and his favorite movie. This is your trivia question here, Chris. What is his favorite movie, Riley Leonard?
I'm gonna go with. Is it Rudy by any chance, Mike?
I mean, I put it right there, and that's his favorite movie of all time. I mean, so the stars aligned, like for him to go there. And I texted you, Chris, the very first, like within like 30 minutes of this offseason, saying when he was saying he was transferring, I immediately texted Chris saying he's going to Notre Dame.
You sent me the 4-leaf clover.
And so that's good. So I thought tonight I'd pick him, as one of the first guys here to talk about. He does have a good quarterback behind him, actually. Steve Angeli is a good quarterback who showed some promise last year, but Riley could help him. I could see that transition of another year, him growing like perfect setup. I mean, similar traits too, which Angeli, watching him play, is like, wow, if he gets a chance, just like in one of the things we'll talk about tonight, Chris and I, is the deep positioning of players on their teams. They're pretty deep. They got 4 and 5 QBs and 4 and 5 running backs, and sometimes it gets a little bit. That's one of the things in college, and you have to kind of there's a little luck involved too there of what guy you're going to pick out of that heap to do well, that year. So Riley last year, he had a big game against Clemson. That was a coming out game, and he had a great game against Notre Dame. So this is Duke playing top 10, top 12 teams, taking a run for their money, and his injuries caught him. But I do like his leadership and tangibles and everything like that. And I hope comes back for him this year. Hope, not just as an Irish fan, but when you see QBs with those traits. I
agree with that. And that 2022 season was Absolute electric season for him. The 250 completions on the 391 attempts, almost 3,000 passing yards, the 20 passing TDs. But in 2022, it was the 124 carries for 700 yards and 13 rushing TDs that made him that fantasy stud. And if he could get back to being that guy for Notre Dame, which, like you, I think the fit is perfect to the style that he plays, he can get back to that QB1 for a college fantasy. So I like the pick there with Riley Leonard. He's got a bunch of good weapons around him. We saw the emergence of Jaden Greathouse there, and we know there's other guys in that wide receiver room that can make Riley Leonard a viable fantasy option. So I dig the pick there. I'm going to follow up your QB, and I'm going to give my QB transfer that I like, and that's quarterback from Indiana to Cincinnati, Brandon Sorsby. Last season he started 7 games, 57.2 completion percentage, 1,500 yards, 15 touchdowns and 5 interceptions. So 1 interception to every 3 touchdowns. Now, what made Brandon Sorsby a top QB option for college fantasy players was his rushing ability. 442 rush yards on 63 attempts, 4.6 yards per carry. He averaged about 9 carries per game, 4 rushing TDs on the season. In those 7 starts, he averaged 20.6 fantasy points per game. Brandon Sorsby is an excellent competitor with an underrated running game, like I just pointed out. Multiple games with double-digit rush attempts, 33 missed forced tackles. He averaged 3 yards after contact. 241 of his 442 rush yards were off designed runs. So the coaching staff trusted Sorsby's abilities enough to put him in the position to rush the ball. 4.6 yards per attempt over his final 3 games. That number jumped up to 6.1. He's a dual threat quarterback. In the terms of dual threat quarterback, he does everything you need, both passing and rushing. And now he enters an offense that utilizes the rushing quarterback. Now, he did struggle a bit with turnovers. The 5 interceptions is nice, but 8 fumbles, averaging just over 1 fumble a game, is where he's going to have to improve. And if he's going to win that QB job in Cincinnati, which most likely he's going to be the QB1 heading into the season, he does have the Brady's there in Drogosh and Lichtenberg, 2 recruits that Cincinnati did bring in themselves. So there's going to be some competition there in the spring games, but I'm looking for Brendan Sorsby to solidify that QB1 role for Cincinnati. If you look at how Cincinnati and that coaching system uses the dual threat quarterbacks, Satterfield's had Malik Cunningham, Armonte Edwards, and this past season, Emory Jones. Diving deeper into their numbers, Malik Cunningham at Louisville averaged 135 carries under Coach Satterfield. Armonte Edwards averaged 206 carries over 3 seasons when Satterfield was coaching the QBs. And just like I mentioned this past season, Emory Jones, career high 155 attempts. Not only that, Sorsby is getting a returning offensive line, 2nd-year unit. Everyone's returning. Everyone's healthy. Sorsby can be that quarterback that you draft in the 8th to 11th round parts of your startup drafts or redrafts, where he can potentially be that QB1 for you. I drafted a bunch of these guys last season within that spot. Byron Browns. There were some other ones in there as well. The names are escaping me at the moment, but these guys can be had for cheap and can produce a high volume of fantasy points. So for me, just like Riley Leonard is a great spot for you based on coaching system and team build, Brendan Sorsby is that guy for me. And he took me to quite a few championships last year when he was starting, and I was able to grab him off waivers. So you're not going to be able to grab him off waivers this year. And as we get closer to the start of the season, the hype for Sorsby in Cincinnati is only going to grow. So we've got Riley Leonard. We've got Brandon Sorsby. Mike's going to jump into a star-studded wide receiver room in Texas.
One of my favorite players. I must have watched how many Alabama games last year. I mean, I don't know. They're on. They're on anyway all the time, right? Every week at 3:30 for the main for a time, or at night. And I didn't know as much about Isaiah to start the year. And like I said, so to give a little picture to everybody last year, like there's so many players to go through, and you can see stats from years prior, and it looked like Ja'Cory Brooks was WR1. Well, that kind of changed in a hurry. You thought he was going to be WR1 with Burton, WR2, and the whole list went on. They kind of had it laid out. So in college, it's in a state of flux, sometimes, and you have to, work with that, because college, things change quickly, and there's students going to school, and you have to adjust. So I learned last year, even in drafting quickly, you need to adjust those first few weeks as to what's happening. But Isaiah Bond, when I started watching him, and he started reminding me after a few games as an NFL comp, he kind of reminded me of Steve Smith Jr. His build, he is about 6 feet, which is good, and his weight is getting up there too, around the 200 and such. Like he's a tough runner, physical runner, and runs good routes. And Jalen Milroe, as we know, to give a bit of background there at Alabama under Coach Saban, there was a QB competition. He ended up winning the competition, sort of. And then even for the first few weeks, they weren't sure. And
not fully.
It really started in game 4, 5, 6, 7. Things started building. And as I was watching some of the games, Bond started being the go-to guy, and Burton would get his targets. Burton would get 3-4 targets, but Bond was starting to equal out in targets. And he ended up with 49 catches on 52 targets. So he almost caught, which that's ridiculous. Like that might not be, we hope his numbers are going to go higher, but that's an amazing statistic. Only 671 yards, 4 touchdowns, but this all came almost during the second half of their run, when they realized they're going to run to the national championship. Yeah. So I tried to pick somebody that, yes, in fantasy last year, like Bond wasn't going to help you win a fantasy championship last year, but Bond moving to Texas, moving into a system with Steve Sarkisian, that pro style, wide open, great play caller, the whole thing. If Bond accelerates, he may lead you to a championship next season. Jumping in there, there's fresh wide receivers. They did lose Adonai Mitchell, Jatavian Sanders, Worthy, and now they've stepped in and filled them. Jonte Cook, another transfer portal, Matthew Golden, and with Bond in there, and Baxter in the backfield, and Ewers coming back, and Manning in behind there, like. So
Tech almost sounds back, Mike. It's Texas back.
Like I almost sound like a Texas Longhorn fan. But they watching them too. Last year I was a little disappointed. Quinn Ewers, had a great year and was great and I had him for fantasy. So I've tried to connect the dots picking these players tonight, that if he ever builds on what he did, he had a great year. Pretty great year for numbers for fantasy, Quinn Ewers. So match him up, do a little stack. We may talk about that in future shows. Stacking is a little more difficult in the college game, but it's the very same thing. Give it a go. Try to go depending who it is. And so I thought he built a steady rapport, Isaiah Bond. He started chipping away and getting more targets, and he is a great route runner, and he caught clutch balls last year to win games. He went to him, which you went from starting the year to a go-to guy. So I can only see him as accelerating, up the ladder. Can only be, sky's the limit. And a lot of his recruiting and his pro profiles, if you go in and read them, like they do have him at top echelon receiver entering in when he's drafted in 2026 eligible. So that's about it on Isaiah Bond. I mean, and I think he's a safe, I would say, is there safe bets? I'd say he's got to be one of the safer bets jumping into that situation. Texas did a great job in their early portal.
Yeah, and The wide receiver room, Mike, I'm not going to lie. I love Isaiah Bond as a player. It kind of scares me a little bit there in Texas. Like you mentioned, they have Jonte Cook. They have DeAndre Moore. They brought in Matthew Golden, Isaiah Bond. They also brought in Oregon State wide receiver and Silas Bolden, a player that we're going to get to in a little bit here in the tight end transfer of Amari Niblack there from Alabama. Right. So Texas is kind of, getting into this situation where they're overloaded, kind of like the Colorado wide receiver room there, where there's just so many mouths to feed.
Or like LSU, when LSU last year, we have our LSU stories, which as you're talking there, Chris, like we do that quite often in fantasy, but as long as those offenses are the high octane scoring, looking at the schedule conference and can hit that 50, 60 point threshold. That's something to let everybody know that the threshold in college is much above higher and beyond the top threshold of scoring in the points. And they tend to, like, I don't want to say run it up all the time, but like there's teams like we're watching and it's just like a video game of the points. Once they really start scoring, they don't let up. So you can sometimes have those guys on that team as opposed to, as we play in the NFL fantasy game, you want that number one, right? To refute that. But I do see your point. So your good point, Chris, on we may not know which one will get the WR1, and we may not know that till we won't know that until.
And it might be a weekly thing where he's the wide receiver 1 in week 1, and then it could be Silas Bolden in week 2, Matthew Golden in week 3, and then go back to Bond in week 4, and then go to someone completely out of the blue in week 5. That's my only worry with the wide receiver room of Texas, or any wide receiver room that has a bunch of guys, is the fact that their opportunity, because of how many mouths there are to feed in that program, are going to be limited in terms of fantasy output. But the next guy we're going to talk about here, I'm not that worried about, because the wide receiver room, albeit does have some gems in it. Evan Stewart going from Texas A&M to Oregon is, for lack of a better term, boner material. Can I say that here? Are we past the kids?
Is this a G rated show? Like how many?
I think we just got put up in the rating there, Mike. PG-13.
Oh my goodness.
But last season, 8 games played, 38 receptions, 514 yards, 4 touchdowns, 10.4 fantasy points per game. Not the stud output that we were looking for from a guy that is considered to some as the wide receiver 1 or wide receiver 2 in that wide receiver class that is eventually going to move up to the NFL. 5-star recruit, the number 1 wide receiver in this year's portal. Like I mentioned, Evan Stewart is heading to the Oregon Ducks, where he's teaming up with new Ducks quarterback Dylan Gabriel before his draft year. Gabriel's got multiple seasons of 30-plus TDs and 3,500-plus passing yards. Stewart was a standout wide receiver at Texas his freshman year, 105 targets, over 600 yards, and a 12.3 yards per reception. The good thing about that yards per reception number is, although his 2023 season wasn't as good as his breakout year in 2022, that yards per reception actually went up from 12.3 to 3.1. Another good sign. If you're just looking at box score here, you're going to look at Evan Stewart and say, well, his season wasn't that great. But another good sign was his yards per route run went up from 2022 to 2023, 1.76 in 2022 to a solid 2.14 in 2023. He's more productive on a per route basis. That's what that number is telling me. And if he can increase that to get to an even high number in Oregon, I'm expecting big things for Evan Stewart. Last year, when quarterbacks targeted Evan, they boasted a solid 100.5 quarterback rating, and that was with a cast of misfit toys. You got Max Johnson, Marcel Reed, Connor Weigman, and Jalen Henderson all throwing the ball this past season for Texas.
Don't bring up Connor Wegman.
Yeah, it's tough, Mike. It's tough. I got quite a few shares of Connor Wegman. It was a tough year. He did deal with the injury, but I'm expecting big things for 2024. But back to Stewart, when you watch the guy on tape, you'll see that he's savvy. You'll see that he's got top end speed. You'll see that that's mixed with quickness in his short burst. He's got strong hands. He's a threat in the red zone. He's got all the tools you need to be considered a top day one NFL draft pick. Right now, I believe his ADP in college fantasy drafts is like mid to back end first round, which is great. Great ad for Evan Stewart. To some, just college fantasy, not even NFL. He is the college fantasy wide receiver 3, I believe, right now in terms of what we're expecting him to produce for the 2024 season. He's heading to Oregon, that is looking to replace their wide receiver 1 in Troy Franklin, who is moving up to the NFL. An offense last year that was second highest in scoring with 44.2 fantasy or 44.2 points per game, second highest in passing yardage, 342 yards per game, second in total offense, an O-line that only allowed 5 sacks, second in yards per play, and an 88% red zone conversion percentage, which is only going to equal to fantasy points for Evan Stewart. Conclusion here, Mike. Stewart enters Oregon as the new Alpha X receiver who's going to be the go-to guy for Dillon Gabriel, an elite pass-friendly offense. Evan Stewart is an early draft pick that is going to pay off handsomely, a top-end Devi and C2C target that should be heavily invested in. Make sure you go out and grab Evan Stewart. Mike, do you own much of Evan Stewart?
Sorry, I'm just scratching his name down now, Chris. Evan Stewart.
Got a question here from Drew 3MR. And I don't know about you, Mike. He asks, is Evan Stewart the wide receiver 1 for next year's rookie draft class? For me, it's Luther Burden out of Missouri. That's my personal wide receiver 1 as of right now. His freshman year, he wasn't the greatest. And then his next year, last year, he was just an absolute stud. So for me right now, Evan Stewart is the wide receiver 2, 3 with Tet McMillan there from Arizona. And then Luther Burden's the hands down 1 for me. But does that change at all for you, Mike?
No, like I drafted Tet McMillan. I think I had him on 2 or 3 teams. I think maybe I played 7 or 8 college fantasy leagues. Tet McMillan.
You don't got to lie. Your wife's not listening. You could say the real number.
Okay, 12. No, I mean, but, he's really good. But Luther Burden was another player for me, sort of like Bond, that I burdened even higher ceiling last year, but yet grew as you're watching that team play, and started cheering for that team. You have, who is the quarterback? Brady, Cook, and Schrader, right? Yeah. And you started watching that team, and you really to believe in that team. They were playing for keeps, and Burden was playing for keeps.
Yeah,
I totally agree with you. Watching him, he's an alpha. And that's a lot of people kind of thought in the circles of fantasy we were watching to see, is he going to jump to be that alpha? I do see that in a few other receivers, but he's going to be right at the top. Yeah, and Stewart, I did not get a chance to watch as many games or film yet on Stewart, but I know Stewart's pedigree. It's totally there.
He did have some personal things from high school carry over to Texas A&M, but I'm hoping him going to Oregon under Dan Lanning can kind of put him on a pathway where he's going to see success. Maybe Texas A&M wasn't the best spot for him to go in terms of keeping him grounded and just concentrated on football. So him going up to Oregon, playing with Dan Lanning, playing with Dillon Gabriel, he's got competence at the quarterback position. Not saying he didn't have that at Texas A&M, but it was just that constant rotation of quarterbacks. Oregon should be Dylan Gabriel, and then that's it. So he's got a quarterback that's going to be able to get him the ball downfield. He's got a quarterback that's going to get him the ball in the intermediate routes, and he's got a coaching system that is going to make sure that the offense is firing on all cylinders. So Evan Stewart is a guy for me that transfer portal wise, absolute stud. And I don't think there was a better landing spot for him in terms of fantasy football purposes. So another, I guess, high profile guy you're going to talk about here, Mike, a guy that some saw as maybe the RB1 in this class, a big body dude, but go and let the people know why Raheem Sanders going to South Carolina is going to be good for fantasy purposes.
Yeah, just so this player, I remember drafting Chris. We all had in how many leagues he was going off the board in the first round and quick.
He goes quick,
usually around 8 or 9, or there was some pick overall. And his year in 2022, so he had 7 100-yard games in 2022, 1,443 yards, 28 receptions, 271 yards on those receptions, 2 TDs, 10 TD scores. He was at the top of his voted, All-American, at the position in the league. So he, coming into 2023, a lot of hype. This is what happens in college as it's warranted. A lot of hype, expecting a big year at Arkansas, and injuries kind of caught him too. So I thought as these players are staying in college, don't give up on them. You want to hit them in the next draft when you've seen the pedigree and you've seen the talent. And he's an alpha runner and a big guy, 6'2", 210.
Big
so
boy.
And can go and can pass catch and everything. So the injuries had got him. So in 2023, he only had 2 TDs and 209 yards, and I have him on my fantasy team, and I'm just, oh my gosh. I might have even texted you, Chris, a couple of times, said, am I going to start this guy when he was injured last week? Yet you're waiting and you want to hit him when he has that big game, and it never came. So I had to put him on my bench, and he's now, I feel good. I chose him in this portal to talk on our first show because now I have him sitting there in a few teams, and he's going to get a fresh start. So I thought this is a great opportunity. Hopefully it works out. Use your football gut on something like that. He's already proven it. Shane Beamer is a great coach in South Carolina, and their program is a hard-nosed program, plays tough, straight-ahead football. I think it's a fit where they like to run the ball, and they'll stick to it. Like they'll stick to that offensive style till they get success. He's one of the more stubborn coaches to do so, and they're scrappy. So I'm hoping maybe anyone they play, they're always in it, and they'll give it all. They may not end up with the wins, but in fantasy, as we know, they're going to scrap and hang around, and they're going to surprise and put points up on the board. So he was a 4-star recruit, and we're going to see where he goes. I hope he rejuvenates and bounces back next year and comes up with some more fantasy points and becomes that bell cow back in South Carolina is my hope. And hopefully, so there they had a few young players there. I believe they have wide receiver Nick Harbor. I think the QB is still going to be Robbie Ashford, but they have your favorite quarterback.
I'm really hoping for
Sellers. Lenore Sellers. So I thought
I'm really hoping for
guy
Sellers, man.
to mention
Robbie
Lenore
Ashford's
Sellers.
Yeah,
I'm trying to suck up to the co-host Chris. I'm trying to put a few guys on here where he's like, "Oh, I love those guys." Like maybe I'll mention Cam Seldon.
Flattery
even
gets
in
you
the
everywhere.
show.
Oh, please, no Cam Seldon, please.
So I think the opportunity will be there for him, and his obviously has been, and hopefully it comes back. And these college careers seem to be. It's interesting drafting these teams and hoping you want to make them hit the next time. If you watch what they did, he's a guy not to give up on. Keep him on your roster, draft him. Hard to know where to draft. Haven't thought about that yet. If we're entering new leagues, where to put him. But in our leagues that dynasty style is nice to have him there. Like it's like that's amazing to have that player like that. Yeah. on the board. So.
Yep, I agree. The only worry for me in
Yeah.
South Carolina is that offensive line, and are they going to be able to do enough for him to be able to find the hole? Are they going to be able to create enough space for Raheem Sanders to be that back that we know he can be? Mike, what is the weight you had him at there?
Well, I had him at 6'2", 210. Maybe
210.
260.
Latest report on Raheem Sanders,
Uh-oh.
245.
Oh.
245. So he's entering
So
that
he's a
Eddie Lacy
also he'll,
tier for me, which is not a good sign, Mike. And
yeah.
I can only imagine what the food is like in South Carolina. So
wow. We know they'll put him on shakes and diets and get him trimmed down and put him on eating nothing. But
he's a
it's
big boy,
interesting.
but he's a big boy that can move, man.
You made a good point there. For everyone, we know the data out there and all the different sites, and it said sometimes they're slower to update at times, and sometimes you got to be patient and where a depth chart is or where the right variables. So it's coming, but when there's that many players, when we think about it, 3 to 4 times more teams and players.
Yeah. Yep.
In fact, that it's a bit of a data crunch to get the accurate.
And like we've seen it today with the measurements coming out of the Senior Bowl, what these websites for these teams post isn't that necessarily what the truth is. We've seen guys come in 2 inches shorter, 10 pounds lighter, or 10 pounds heavier. So these are just guidelines that we're kind of using here until we get the official number. But 245 for a 6'2" running back is big. So hopefully it's dense muscle that he's carrying and not just a spare tire around him. But I'm looking forward to Raheem Sanders this year in
Marshawn Lynch.
Oh, Marshawn! I'm hoping we can get a Marshawn Lynch out of a Raheem Sanders. So we had Riley Leonard, we had Brendan Sorsby, Isaiah Bond, Evan Stewart. Mike just dropped Raheem Sanders. My next player here is none other than wide receiver Jeremy Bernard. Last season, 7 games started, 34 receptions, 419 yards, 2 touchdowns with 2 rushing TDs. He's a 4-star recruit, 6'1", 205 pounds. And it's really just the fact that Jeremy Bernard is following his coaching staff from the University of Washington to the University of Alabama. And that's head coach Kalen DeBoer going from Washington to Alabama. And while he was at Michigan State, through, you find out these things when you do research on these guys. He was actually recruited to Washington originally, pulled his letter of intent, went to Michigan State for a year. After Michigan State, moved back over to the University of Washington, where he actually earned playing time on a team that featured Rome Odunze, Jalen Polk, and Jalen McMillan. Didn't put up great numbers, but in a wide receiver room like that, all 3 of those guys moving up to the NFL, that's great news for Jeremy Bernard moving into the 2024 season. He's going to Alabama, a team that has a wide receiver room with a bunch of vacancies. Jermaine Burton to the NFL, Isaiah Bond, like Mike just talked about, to Texas. Ja'Cory Brooks transferred to Louisville. Shaz Preston transferred to Tulane. And Malik Benson transferred to Florida State. So the opportunity is there for Jeremy Bernard to be the guy in Alabama, to be the guy for Kalen DeBoer in that Alabama offense. And if they use them like they used them at the University of Washington, I'm expecting a big year out of Jeremy Bernard. In Michigan State, he played more of that outside wide receiver role. But when he came to Washington, he pivoted to more of a slot wide receiver, and slot wide receivers under DeBoer flourished last year. Jalen Polk, 108 targets, 69 receptions, 1,159 yards, and 9 TDs. And then if you go back to the year before that, 2022, Jalen McMillan, another NFL talent, 118 targets, 79 receptions, 1,098 yards, and 9 touchdowns. So with all of that, if DeBoer brings the game plan that he ran at Washington to Alabama and uses Jeremy Bernard the way he used them at Washington, he is set up to succeed. Like I mentioned, it's a wide receiver room that has been decimated since Coach Saban retired. Everyone's leaving. Guys are leaving left and right there. So I believe all they got is Kobe Prentice there and Kendrick Law left. So wide open room, coach's guy, big bodied, 4-star, does all the right things. I'm looking for Jeremy Bernard to have a big year in Alabama. Mike, do you know much about Jeremy? Do you own much of Jeremy? Do you know much about the Alabama offense?
No, so what came to me as you're saying there, yeah, he made some big plays at key moments. So Penix found him on,
he did.
Polk was injured. Polk wasn't injured. McMillan was injured for a number of games and in and out, and they kept putting him in the starting lineup. So it led me to think of a few things with Washington, since their players were on so many teams and impacting so many fantasy teams. Washington throughout the whole year of fantasy last year. Starts and sits and data can come in on injuries. That's one thing to keep an eye on when you're building your teams, that finding that information before games. Chris and I'd be even back and forth. Who's starting? Who's sitting? Who's this? And when it's Washington, you want to start those guys. Yeah. And then Gurmy had some good games when then McMillan would sit and didn't play. So it's not the impact. They just had a solid wide receiver room. He made some big plays when they're in there. And point two, when you mentioned Jalen Polk, who's could be pretty good in the upcoming draft. He was on waivers on many teams. It came to me as you're saying that. I can't believe. Think about that. Jalen Polk was undrafted, because there's so many players that you had to scoop him up to get people excited here to play. You're like, a guy like that was available, and that helped you win leagues when you were sharp those first few weeks. Scooped him in a couple, couldn't get him in all of them and suddenly you'd see, oh my gosh, this guy is great receiver. Yep. And they're putting up great points. So that makes it fun in college, where you have that draft. The drafts are deep, and then there's still guys like that you see in those first few, and I can get those players on my team and compete on waivers.
Exactly. And that's the point I was making at the top. You're never out of it in college fantasy. You can lose your first 5 draft picks to injury or something else, and then you can turn over your roster so much. You're never out of it. You're always in the position to be in the game. You're always in the position to be in the hunt. Of course, until you're mathematically eliminated, then you're out, kick rocks. But until then, I mean, you are always within striking distance because of the players that you can grab off waivers, because of how deep it is. You're always involved in the game. So Jeremy Bernard, also a guy, if you play C2C or Debbie, that you could probably pick up late, considering what he's going to be at Alabama. Possibly the wide receiver one there could vault his draft status. This guy, he's a talented kid, man. He got a decent shake at Michigan, decent shake at Washington, but had a bunch of guys in front of him. Now he's the wide receiver one in Alabama.
Question for you, rebuttal question there for you. They just lost not a player, but they lost a coach. One of my favorite coaches coming to my NFL team, the Browns. Yeah. What do you think, Chris, will be that? I liked him in Alabama. He grew, and then they're gone.
Yeah, I don't hate it because of the head coach they brought in there. They brought in an offensive-minded head coach, a coach that's taken programs to levels that these programs, envisioned when they hired a guy like DeBoer. So I'm expecting big things out of the Alabama offense, only because of who the head coach is there. Now, we got 2 more to get through before we end the very first episode of the One Foot Down podcast. I appreciate each and every person that has tuned in and dropped a comment. If you like what you see, like the stream, subscribe to the channel, ring that notification bell for whenever the Fantasy and Frames team drops new content. Mike, your last player on the list. What you got, man? This is a big one because there was a lot of news around this guy about the NFL.
Yeah. So this was one of my favorite players and quarterbacks for the following and researching over the years. When you realize he played 2 years at Incarnate Word and put up good numbers, and has good physical traits and tools, and is a smooth QB all around. And teams were kind of pining over him from Incarnate Word. There was a bit of a competition thing there to see where he would go, and he ended up in Washington State. And Washington State was and this isn't no disrespect to it all. We know how good Washington was, but it was almost like Washington State was like the little brother to Washington, but yet that little brother was pretty tough, and the little brother could compete, and their game, like, it was almost like a mirror of two teams, good wide receivers, Williams, this alpha, and staying in the games. And Cam Ward kind of has that. So his pedigree of like staying in the game, he does not give up on ball games, and his numbers at Incarnate Word and Washington State. So there's 4 years where his average completion percentage of all those years hovers consistent. I'd say the best thing, he's consistent for fantasy, 65 to 67% completion, always throwing over 3,000 yards, all of those seasons, 25 TDs, and picks aren't too big a problem. I think 7 picks or something last season. 2022, he had 9 interceptions. So 2022 numbers, 3,200 yards, 23 passing touchdowns. 2023, 3,700 yards last year at Washington State, 27 touchdowns, 7 INTs, so pretty good. 8 rushing TDs. The average rush was a little bit low, but I think more is there that he could do that. He may not be, Riley Leonard, compiling those type of numbers, but he can do it, and he's not afraid to do it. So as he runs his offense, but I like that his numbers for all those years were so consistent, and you know what you're getting. If you get somebody that's throwing almost 4,000 yards, 30 TDs, running 10, that's what we want in fantasy. So it's interesting as you said there, he declared for the NFL and then quickly had a change of heart, and then decided to transfer to Miami.
Yeah,
which was interesting because Miami lost Tyler Van Dyke, who transferred to Wisconsin. So the door was open, but yet, as I've done a little bit more digging, yes, I believe Cameron Ward will likely, get the starting job, but that's the thing in college fantasy. We have to follow the spring. There's lots to follow to see. They also brought in another quarterback, and also in the portal, and to give him a chance. And they also have Ja'Cory Brown, who played a little bit last year, and his numbers were pretty good. Signals are that you're going after a guy like Cam Ward to start, but yet they've made the room a bit of competition. And interestingly, Mario Cristobal is a good offensive mind, pro-style spread offense, uses everyone. Last year, there was guys, Chris loaded up his guys on Hurricane. Every time I saw Chris's new team on fantasy, had Miami receivers, guys, George,
Xavier
guys
Restrepo.
I haven't, and he has me digging up all these guys, like who, hearing it in chat, and I'm like, oh my, another guy, 100 some yard, 2 score, and what's going on? But Mario Cristobal, so to give them, credit where it's due, good offensive mind, but yet the wins aren't there. Like, they're at the 500. Are they above? Are they not? He's under, as they all are, but a little bit of pressure there. They got to turn it into wins. So I think that's why it's good if they can get Ward. If they can get that type of number, which that's going to be the question to go into a tougher, place, Miami, and down there, and the pressure in a big school like that, maybe they can turn that around. And Cristobal needs to do that. He was a 4-star, enter into college football. One comp, I mean, that I kind of thought of, I only thought of a comp player for a couple of these guys, but he kind of reminds me of like a Tyrod Taylor that could be a little better than a Tyrod Taylor, like how he moves a little bit in the pocket, holds, and and that's not a bad thing. We watched Tyrod now older doing, and has had some good years. Kind of see it in Cam Ward if he gets even a little more agile, you can see that in there. But in his arm strength, he can make the throws, and that's just a bit of a comp to keep on your mind. Keeps his eyes downfield, plays always open. He's always looking, which is what these things are, the athletic traits you can't necessarily always teach some of these guys. They just want to keep stuff alive, which showed they're determined to keep moving that ball and not making too many errors. The picks aren't too bad. So you got to think you're making the decisions pretty accurately most of the time. But it'll be interesting to see. That's going to be interesting down there. I think that receiver Stang that you mentioned in Miami, I think he's still there.
Stang, yeah.
And I think George is still there, I believe, too. I was looking up as who might be there, which is important if you're to bring him in and to keep cohesive unit there with Cristobal and them, see where they can go with it. But so I'm excited to see him. I got him on a few teams too. So
the good stuff. So who are you taking then if you're up to draft and you need a quarterback? Are you taking Cam Ward or are you taking Riley Leonard?
Oh, yeah. See, like you can't do that to me, Chris. That is like, so now my heart.
That's what I do, Mike.
It's like, so it's the conversation we had before. The players we're bringing up, like Riley Leonard could go off in Notre Dame. I mean, I've seen QBs. We can all mention them. I mean, Ritter had a good year. I mean, I can think of guys that have had big years there. Lots of touchdown passes when the team is designed, but you can also get in the tough games and defensive games, and the stats for fantasy might not be there. If you had to go on a coin, like Cam Ward's fantasy in that offense with how they're going to play, his numbers would be comparable or possibly higher than Leonard. You never know. But if Leonard ever reaches his bar on what he's going into, but it's tough, but their schedule is tough. So one thing to look at in fantasy, as we thought in the portal, these are our favorite landing spots to see if we can get potential out of these guys. But when you start crunching the numbers, like Cam Ward could go off the charts, like in Miami, if they get things, how they run their offense and how the initial things they try to do in the throwing passing game and everything like that. Notre Dame a little more balanced, but yet Riley Leonard can run. So it's a tough one. I'd be like going,
way to say a bunch of words and not answer the question, Mike. Way to go.
I will be drafting Riley Leonard before him due to me being a fan.
Okay, so you got the bias.
But Cam Ward will be my super flex starter.
I love it. Let's pivot to our last guy right on after us. Stick around. We got the Shoot the Gap show with Jorge Edwards and Chris Burns breaking down the IDP fantasy football studs. Our last player here on the very first episode of the 1 Foot Down podcast is Alabama to Texas transfer tight end Amari Niblack. Last year, 5 games started, 9 games played, 20 receptions, 437 yards, 4 touchdowns, all career highs. Was the third leading receiver on Alabama last season, which doesn't say a lot for the Alabama receiving game, considering he only has 20 receptions and 437 yards. But 4-star prospect, 6'4", 233 pounds. So he's got the size to be that red zone factor for Texas. Just like Jeremy Bernard, Niblack's transfer stems from his ties from the current coaching staff at Texas with former offensive coordinator at Alabama, Steve Sarkisian, who like I just said, is the head coach for Texas. As I mentioned, big-bodied. He is ranked as the #1 tight end in the portal and the number 28 player overall, according to 24sports.com. He lands on Texas, who just lost tight end Jatavian Sanders to the NFL, who in 2023 is vacated 67 targets, which put him at the tight end 6 overall in that department. And in 2022, 73 targets. Again, tight end 6 overall. He has tight end 1 usage, was tight end 6 in yards in 2022, and tight end 3 in yards in 2023. So all this is telling me, all this information here is telling me is that Texas likes to utilize their tight ends, and Amari Niblack is going to enter Texas as the tight end one. He's fast. He's athletic. He's a downfield playmaker who will use his size and catch radius to be the go-to guy for Quinn Ewers, a guy that Mike mentioned a little bit earlier. There was just a handful of SEC tight ends last season to have one or fewer drops while being targeted over 30 times. Niblack lined up outside or in the slot on over half of his pass play snaps, whereas the rest he lined up as an inline tight end. Sanders was primarily the tight end that Sarkisian lined up out wide or in the slot roughly about 37% of his snaps the last 2 seasons, and Amari Niblack can absolutely fill that role. Another positive for Amari is that his blocking ability is more than that of the guy that he is replacing in Jatavian Sanders. Higher graded pass blocker than Sanders last season. Niblack blew just 1 block in 125 blocking snaps on offense compared to 9 blown blocks over just 400. Yes, I know the sample size here, 400 to 125, but if I was to just average it out, I mean, that's 4.5. Let's give him 5 blown coverage, blocking coverages there over Jatavian Sanders, who blew 9 blocking assignments in 400 snaps. So gonna be solid for what Texas is gonna use him for. He's gonna be on the field a lot. The vacated targets, the athleticism, the usage of the tight end, a tight end one finish is incoming for Amari. The 8th tight end picked in Jared Palmgren from Chasing the Natty, another college fantasy shows a way too early mock with some of the industry's best taking part in that mock. He was picked in the 9th round. He's already getting that tight end one draft value, and that's only going to increase as the season rolls. As we see the spring games come in, the spring practices, we see what his usage is going to be in that offense. I'm expecting big things out of Amari Niblack. A big waiver ad for me last season through the waiver process in these college leagues. So Amari Niblack, if you are looking for a tight end, can be that guy that you want in terms of fantasy usage. So Mike, first episode in the books, brother. We talked about some of our favorite transfer portal landing spots. Riley Leonard, who went from Duke to Notre Dame. Brendan Sorsby from Indiana to Cincinnati. Isaiah Bond from Alabama to Texas. Evan Stewart from Texas A&M to Oregon. We had the big-bodied running back Raheem Sanders, who went from Arkansas to South Carolina. We had wide receiver Jeremy Bernard, who went from Washington to Alabama. Cam Ward, one of Mike's favorites, Washington State to Miami. And then we close it off with Amari Niblack going from Alabama to Texas. I mean, Mike, is Texas looking at Alabama and just going, look at me. With all the transfers that they are just poaching from Alabama.
As we thought it's a whole other show we could do on Texas and Ohio State, because I think they're on a collision course that looks like astronomical proportions. And it's actually lining up like not fair, but they really will.
Don't count out Georgia now.
And Georgia. You don't even have to mention Georgia. They're like, but yeah, those Georgia, 2 are really Georgia. There's a whole show we'll be able to do on the players that went back that looked like they decided not to declare. That show is going to be, that'll be good. The non-declares going back for fantasy.
But, that's it for us, Mike. Let the people know where they can find you, big guy.
Well, right there, you find it there on X. Look at me being the old guy. I almost said Twitter. You can't be saying that. Twitter. What's Twitter? But finding me on there, I'll try to get more material up. I'm my partner in crime here, Chris, is getting me in the loop to start posting more things, and you can find me there and find me on this show. And I'm just gonna go with it. Excited for the college year starts now. Never stops.
Sir. Yes, sir. And we appreciate, again, everyone that tuned in. Drop the comment, like the stream. We appreciate each and every one of you. Make sure if you're listening to this in podcast form that you rate and review the podcast. All your love is appreciated. I'm Chris. You can find me at FFChrisB. Make sure you follow Fantasy and Frames at Fantasy and Frames. We cover fantasy football across the board and right on after us. I know they're probably waiting patiently or impatiently is the Shoot the Gap IDP show with Jorge Edwards and Chris Burns. Mike, that's it for us. First show in the book, first of many. I'm looking forward to episode 2. For Mike, I'm Chris. Toodles.
Peace.